a little further from here. Let's go to frosh.ims 4, and now we can make this a little more interesting. So notice here that frosh.ims 4 actually submits to itself. So this actually is going to lend itself to a more elegant solution. There's sort of a bad user interface decision I made in the previous examples in that I fill out the form, I submit the form, I go to a new page, register1, register2, register3.php, and if there's any error, yes, I can redirect the user back, but there was no explanation as to why they ended up back at the original page. And also, I'm telling them the error message in the more recent versions, and then they have to hit back, right? That's just a bad design. Why not just provide the user with immediate feedback on the same screen so that they can then proceed to fix whatever problem they created, right? You might remember websites, they still exist today, where not only do they make you see the error message, then click back, what sometimes happens when you do hit the back button? Right? The whole form has been emptied, right? This is horrible design. And this is somewhat browser dependent, somewhat language dependent. Let's at least try to avoid these ridiculous designs. So as a result of this more friendly user interface, my file is going to be a little more complex. So let's actually see what's going on here. So in the top of frosh.ims 4, I again have some comments. And now I'm going to have a special check here. So it turns out you can check, you can ask a question, was this field even submitted? Was it set, so to speak, by some HTML form? And $_post, quote unquote, action means I must have defined an HTML form element whose name is action. This is arbitrary. We could do this in different ways, but I chose to go as follows. If you scroll down and scroll down and scroll down, notice that this time, even though my input button is of type submit, notice I also gave it a name. What's the result here? Well, when I click that button, because it has a name, it's going to get submitted to the server. So now, even if the user does not fill out any of the fields, they did at least submit the form by clicking it or by hitting enter. So no matter what in this scenario, at least one parameter is going to be sent to the server, in this case called arbitrarily action. So I now, the programmer, can at least check, was the form actually submitted, or did the user just pull up the URL without filling out a form? In other words, I want to distinguish between a post submission and a simple get, where a get is just the result of opening up this URL in a page. In other words, if I go to my browser and I go to frosh.ims 4 and just click it, and damn it, thank you. All right, so PHP is really easy, though, really. So as an aside, let me explain this so that it's not completely lost on us. So PHP, long story short, has different levels of errors. There's something called an error. There's something called a warning. There's something called a notice. And those are in descending order of severity. In C, we made any possible mistake you made just called an error. And that's why you couldn't even compile your code in C sometimes if you had an error. PHP has even more layers of severity. And so what we typically do in the appliance is we disable notices. Because notices aren't really errors, but they aren't necessarily perfect lines of code. So in this case, I cut a corner, which meant you really shouldn't do that. But the web server yelled at me as a result. I've just told the web server, don't yell at me. And I'll fix this properly later. pset 7, you'll see in the file called common.php, you will see, or in common.php, you'll see that we did exactly the same disabling there. All right, so what's going to happen in this version? I'm going to go ahead and register as David, as captain, mail from Matthews, and click. Actually, let's leave one of these unfilled. Register. So now, still very simple web page, of course, but at least now this is a little more dynamic. Still kind of sucky in that I haven't repopulated the form fields, but at least I've given some immediate feedback. So how did this happen? Well, apparently, this form, as we saw in the source code, submits not to register something, but rather to itself. So the same PHP file submits to itself. So this is why we need to distinguish between, was this a GET request or was this a POST request? In other words, did the user just type this URL manually and end up here, in which case there was no error because they literally just got here? Or did they click the submit button, in which case they got here by way of a form submission, in which case we should yell at them. So now everything's self-contained, hence the need for this condition up top. So if we now go to frosh.ims 4.php, you can ignore this notice line up here. Let's see what's actually going on. So if the form was submitted, so if post action was submitted, and if name is empty, or gender is empty, or dorm is empty, notice that I'm doing this. I'm setting a variable called $error equal to true. And just for good measure, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and say error by default is false. So we do have the notion of Booleans in PHP, even though we don't say the keyword bool. But if the user screws up in this way, then I'm going to go ahead and say error gets true. So now let's scroll down here. And here is where that red text is coming from. So the rest of this form is as it's always been. But at the very top of my file, I've decided to say quickly in PHP, if error is true, then, thanks to this colon, go ahead and output something called a div, whose text color is going to be red, according to the CSS property here, and then just yell at the user. You must fill out the form, and then open bracket / div. But notice down here that none of these elements at the moment have any kind of default value. The reason that this form has not been refilled out for me is because I literally have not said, give this field a value, give that field a value, give something else a value. So we might actually need to fix this ourselves. So let me go ahead this time and open up frosh.ims 5. And this one is going to do a little something different. Let me go ahead and just paste this in so that we can ignore one of those errors for a moment. And let me scroll down here. Notice that this form also submits to frosh.ims 5, so to itself. Notice that I'm yelling at the user if error is true. So that story is identical. But now notice what I'm doing. That's a little bit different. And the font's going to wrap a little bit. So let me zoom out. Notice now my input tag is almost the same. Name is name, coincidentally. Type is text. But this time I've added an attribute value. And notice this little PHP trick here. So this is PHP code. Inside of this HTML attributes value is a bit of PHP code, which very quickly says to the web server, interpret this. Well, what is being interpreted? Well, HTML special chars is a special escape function so that whatever the user has typed, you're going to escape it. Just as in the way we've escaped certain characters in C, HTML special chars is a function that says if the user typed in something crazy, make sure it displays literally as what they typed and doesn't mess with the web page. And we'll see what not doing that would create in a moment. So what am I printing out? We'll go ahead and print out the result of whatever the user typed into the name field. Close quote. So in other words, when the user types in their name, but maybe skips the dorm or gender and clicks submit, we can at least, when the form is reloaded, pre-populate this value this time as follows. So let me go ahead and zoom out. Let me go ahead and fill in for frosh.ims 5.php. Let me go ahead and fill out name, but I'm going to skip all the other fields and click register. And notice I got yelled at, but notice this time the form did get filled out for me. Let's go ahead and right-click or control-click on the browser. And if I scroll down, notice here, to be clear, the browser never sees PHP. PHP is executed server-side, not client-side. So all of this is the output of PHP, or the raw HTML that I wrote. Here's that div. And notice it's kind of weirdly indented, because even though my PHP code was nice and pretty, that white space is also sent to the browser, so it's kind of throwing things off. But that's fine. We don't care about pretty printing your HTML, just your actual PHP code. Let's scroll down here, and here's the difference. Now, this time, there's a value field that has spit out, quote unquote, David, because I had that additional line of PHP code. And notice here, if I scroll down, these guys are not yet pre-populated because I didn't fill them out. So let's see what the opposite of this is. So I actually did use best practice there, whereby I did use this function HTML special chars. But let's see if I can do something a little hackish. Let me get rid of this, and let me just say, put inside of these quotes whatever the user typed into the name field. All right, and now notice one new piece of syntax. Notice this trick here. This means, because the equal sign is right next to the dollar sign, put this value here. This is equivalent to saying something like this, or even saying something like this with parenthesis, and so forth. So this is just nice sort of shorthand notation. So let me go back to the original, and just this says put my name here. Let me zoom out. And now let's see if a malicious user can maybe break my website. So I am now the user who's just trying to be difficult. I'm some bad guy trying to compromise this website. And if I kind of suspect that the person who implemented this site was not very good and not security conscious, what if I can trick this page into outputting HTML that wasn't intended? Well, typing in David still works. It still populates that field. But notice what we could do here. If I view the page source again and I scroll to the David part, notice that I've just been cooperative as the user. I typed in DAVID, but I feel like I could type some crazy stuff here too. What if I instead typed in to this form, quote, close, B, ha ha ha, register. Interesting. Like, I'm the only one I'm sort of damaging here is myself, right? Because I'm not actually attacking the website. But this was not intended. And in fact, this is representative of a sort of attack that's possible. Long story short, there's this other language called JavaScript, which is executed server client side. And so what a lot of bad guys typically do, especially in phishing emails, is if they've realized some website, even something silly like a FrosIM site, has not escaped users' input properly, what they'll do is try to trick you into sending some JavaScript code to this form so as to steal your cookie, some cookie from the website. And we'll see in a while that stealing cookies means that your shopping cart, your $_session variable can be compromised, and anything you've put in there can be taken over by someone else, including, for instance, your Facebook account. Now, if we go back here and I change this back to the right way, where I'm actually escaping these inputs with this annoyingly long function name, but still nonetheless useful, HTML special chars. And now I resubmit this form as I did before. Let's start over. So I'm going to go ahead and type close quote, close bracket, ha 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 ha, register. Now I literally see that again in the form, because what the server has done for me, what PHP has done for me is this. Notice that there are things with ampersands and semicolons now. So it turns out that HTML has these things called entities. And these are entities in that they represent special characters that normally would break HTML. And it's a little cryptic, some of them, but ampersand, GT, semicolon means the greater sign, the greater than sign. Ampersand LT semicolon is the less than sign. Ampersand QUOT semicolon is the quotation mark. So there are a few of these well-known entities that PHP can spit out so that even if the user is being difficult, you can at least protect the site against being tricked into executing something that wasn't intended. And even though the source code looks like this, obviously, as we just saw, those entities are converted back to their original characters before being shown to the user. Now, the one thing we haven't yet done here, and really has made this site useful, we have no capability thus far to actually remember that users are stored or have registered. For that, we're going to need a database. But before that, we're going to need a break. So why don't we resume here in 5.